And the Pharisees' attention starts turning, away from John. And we saw that in John 1:24, that he had, he was on their radar. But now they're kind of changing their focus to Jesus, right? They're putting their focus in their opposition to Jesus. And we saw that as we were working through chapter 3, that more and more of that focus is going towards Jesus, because more people are going to him. And John 3:26, and they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing, and all are coming to him. And then a few verses down in verse 30, it says, he must increase, but I must decrease. So with this increasing popularity of Jesus, we see that animosity of the Pharisees begin to shift towards Jesus. And they realize that Jesus is becoming not just a threat, but, a greater threat than John was to them and to this, system of Judaism, this traditional system of Judaism. And because of this, Jesus is going to leave Judea and he's going to head north to Galilee, away from Jerusalem, because that's where, that was the center of the Jewish leadership and rule. And then we have this statement in verse 2, right, in parentheses, this parenthetical comment that's made, that Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. So we know it's by Jesus' authority that this baptism is being done, but kind of a question I'll put out there is, why do you think Jesus himself did not physically do the baptizing? Right? Why do you think he didn't physically do the baptizing? Why were the disciples doing the baptizing? Any thoughts on that? Well, this baptism that was going on, they were baptizing there. They were coming to Jesus to get baptized. He was telling them to be baptized. But it says in verse 2 here that though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. Cody?
They start talking about who's baptized. If you're baptized by Brian, Cody, Furman, that's one thing. If you were baptized by Jesus, you have a tendency to maybe elevate yourself. And so we do see that in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. They were elevating themselves based on who baptized them. So I think the wisdom was not to do that physical act, to have people be baptized.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, just that verse is showing that wisdom of Jesus there. Because just as Cody said, we're going to see that issue pop up later. But think about that. Yeah, okay, you want to get you're hearing Jesus teach, and he's calling you to be baptized, and him and his disciples are there. Whose line are you going to get in to be baptized? Well, I'm gonna go here and get in Jesus' line. He's probably got he would have that long line, and then maybe a few of the other apostles are going to have a few people, but that's what it could lead to, and that could cause a problem. Being bragging like Jesus baptized me, boasting about it. And as Cody said, we see that similar problem that Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and beginning in verse 11. For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, or I'm of Cephas, I am of Christ? Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest anyone should say that I baptized in my own name. Yes, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Besides, I do not know whether I baptized any other. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. So in the church of Corinth, we see, those Christians were boasting over which apostle baptized them. So Paul is glad that he did not baptize any of them because of that very problem. Another thing that can get misconstrued with that verse 2 that we see there, is that there are those who will look at that verse and use it as an argument that, that baptism is not necessary because Jesus didn't perform it. And I think what really that verse shows is that wisdom of Jesus, that it could cause problems if he was the one doing it, right? If Jesus is not baptizing, that does not show that baptism is not necessary, because if it wasn't, then why are the disciples doing it, right? Jesus is the one teaching. He's calling on those to be baptized, and the disciples are doing it. If it's not necessary, then why do it? I think that's pretty obvious, but there are those that will argue, since Jesus didn't do it, it's not necessary. And I don't think that the verse shows that. If Jesus baptized people himself, we would see most likely those problems that occurred with the church in Corinth. Verse number 3, Jesus is leaving. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. So he's leaving that epicenter of Judaism there in his day and his time. In verse 4, but he needed to go through Samaria. He needed to go through Samaria. So we have this geographic marker here. Verse 4 tells us that Jesus had to pass through Samaria. So geographically, the direct route from Jerusalem to Galilee is going straight through Samaria, right? It's just straight north. But that was not the only way. That was not the only way to Galilee. You could travel east and then go north and then come into Galilee from the west. But it was a longer journey, right? It was not, I don't know how that saying goes, the way the crow flies, or how the crow flies, something to that effect, which would have been just a straight shot, right? You'd have to go a longer route if you didn't want to take that straight path north. You'd have to go round, which would mean a longer journey, right? Which was difficult. I remember traveling at this time was difficult. So there was another route, but I think John's point here, it's more than just like geographical, more than just geography. The Samaritans were hated by the Jews, right? Samaritans were hated by the Jews. They were a mixed race of Jews who had intermarried with the foreigners who had come into the land, and the Judean Jews didn't really regard the Samaritan Jews as Jewish. There was never this kinship between the two, and because of this prejudice that existed, neither group really tolerated traveling in the territory of the other. Right? Most Jews went through this alternate route, that longer route, to bypass that area, the Samaritans, because they saw them as offensive and they wanted to avoid them. I think, and I don't know how true this is, but I think they may have even considered themselves or someone who like step foot on land to be unclean. But they basically did what they could to avoid them in their area. But in verse 4, but he needed to go through Samaria. But Jesus needed to go through Samaria. You know, Jesus has got something to do in Samaria, right? He's got an appointment there. It's what's going to happen is not by accident. It's not by accident. It's part of the plan of God. You know, Jesus did not hesitate to travel through this territory, through the Samaritan territory. The hatred for the Jews to the Samaritans, the social hatred that existed, it didn't deter Jesus, right? He's going to connect with this woman, and you know that's part of the plan. Beginning of verse 5. So he came to the city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat there by the well. It was about the 6th hour. So Jesus goes and goes to this well and sits beside it. And in verse 6, it tells us that he was wearied from his journey. He was wearied from his journey. You know, it was a long day of traveling. And again, at that time, traveling was difficult during that time. It was probably hot. But he was wearied. He was beat. He was exhausted. Yesterday, my son and my nephew had a basketball game. And they were really putting forth effort in this game. And come halftime, you could just see they're pouring down sweat. And my nephew Mako comes up to me and he's like, where's that Gatorade? Where's that Gatorade? And he was frantic. He wanted something to quench his thirst. I'm like, oh, here, right there. And he just chugged that Gatorade as quick as he could. But he was tired. He was exhausted. He wanted some relief. And what we see here is Jesus is wearied after this time of travel. So it's a little glimpse into the humanity of Jesus that we see there. You know, he was wearied, he was tired, exhausted from traveling, and that humanity is being expressed. And we see, he can relate to us, right? We've been there. We've been through that. He can understand that, right? He, Jesus has experienced the limitations and challenges that come with this body that we have, right? So he experienced that same thing. Let's look at the next area as we get into this engagement here in verse 7. And I'm going to read through verse 12. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it was who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get the living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" So it's about the 6th hour. The Samaritan woman, comes from the village in order to draw water from the well that Jesus is near. And Jesus defies this tradition of the time, and speaks to the woman to request a drink of water, right? He's weary. He wants, but we see that's not really his main purpose. But I think we can see, even though he's weary, he has limitations, he's also committed. But, most Jews were disdainful towards the Samaritans. So we can understand why she's kind of surprised here by Jesus' question. One is, why is it that a Jewish man would speak to a Samaritan woman, right? And two, why would, especially in public, and then why would a Judean Jew ask water, from a Samaritan? Because of that prejudice they had, that hatred they had. So there's a couple things at play here. And so although she's surprised, she engages in this conversation. She enters into this conversation with Jesus. In verse 10, Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." So, Jesus uses this physical element to illustrate this spiritual principle, right? Both the elements of the person of Jesus as well as the water are used to teach this spiritual truth that Jesus is indeed the Messiah who is prophesied by God, and that the water which he brings is the water of life, right? The water of life, referring to, salvation. And Jesus suggests that, if the Samaritan woman were fully aware of his identity, then she would have asked water of him. That's what he's getting at. Jesus means like a spiritual water that quenches spiritual thirst. And she doesn't quite grasp that yet. Jesus asked her for a drink, and she asked, it's almost like she's thinking, you're asking me for a drink? You should ask me for a drink. If you knew who I was, the gift of God, you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water. So she's likely surprised by this, confused. She's maybe thinking, okay, you just asked me for a drink, and now you're telling me that I should ask you for a drink. So you can see where she's probably kind of wrestling with this a little bit here. But her response leads us to believe that she's still thinking in a physical plane, a physical level. But she's respectful, right? And not just respectful, but she's a little curious because, she's curious as to how that, he's going to draw this water, because he doesn't have a pot, he doesn't have a bucket there. So we see this, a little insight into what she's thinking, what's going on with the conversation, and she sees it. And in verse 12, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? So she's still thinking, the Samaritan woman is still thinking in physical terms. She's still thinking in physical terms. And she asks, basically it's like if Jesus is as good a well digger as Jacob. So still on this physical level. Look at verse 13. I'm going to read a few verses here. Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw." So Jesus' response identifies him as being greater than Jacob, right? Identifies him as being greater than Jacob, but not just on a physical level. He's greater on as we see, also on a spiritual level, right? Jesus informs the woman that the water which he is able to provide, that it quenches one's thirst permanently, right? Permanently. And then in verse 15, her response reflects that, like that she almost gets it, or you think she almost gets it. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst." You think, okay, maybe she's understanding it on the spiritual level, but then it's like, "Lord, come here to draw." So it's like, okay, nope, she's not getting it. So she's still thinking purely on this physical level, And, she stated, "Lord, come here to draw." So she's thinking about that physical toll of actually performing this task of, this daily, probably a daily thing of having to go, draw the water, take it back to the village, in the elements. I don't know how long of a trip it was, but I'm sure it was, some strain. It was somewhat strenuous. So again, she's thinking about, this on a physical level. And here's the thought. Here's the thought that I came across doing this study is, how many seek to follow Jesus for the physical rest that they think that he provides, right? How many are seeking that physical rest, that relief from life, there's the daily struggles in life, rather than the spiritual blessings that are only found in Jesus, right? Because that's what we're kind of seeing here. She's still focused on that physical, that physical relief that she may get, as opposed to the spiritual, which is Jesus is trying to get her to see. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, You have well said, "I have no husband," for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband, and that you spoke truly. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." So she's thinking on this physical level, but Jesus, he really turns the conversation in a way that it's going on a spiritual level. And, he asked her to call her husband to him. And then, the honesty of her, the integrity of her, is seen there in verse 17 in her answer. "I have no husband." And then Jesus, he acknowledged that, he compliments her on her honesty. And in verse 18, we see that Jesus then revealed, his knowledge that, she's had 5 husbands, and that the man that she was currently living with was not actually, her husband at all. Verse 19, the Samaritan woman, go ahead, James. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, James. And in verse 19, we see that she starts to make this transition from that physical to the spiritual. And then she identifies Jesus as a prophet. So she can understand, okay, there's more going on here. Beginning in verse 20, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So the Samaritan woman, she's transitioning in her understanding in this conversation from the physical to the spiritual. And then she brings up this subject that was, controversial for them at the time regarding worship between the Jews, the Judean Jews and the Samaritan Jews. And she had just called Jesus a prophet. So she may have been seeking, clarification on this, this controversy that was going on between this worship, and saw him as, she referred to him as a prophet. So she's thinking, okay, well, this man's probably qualified to address this controversy. So what I'm getting at is that, she's starting to think spiritually now. And then, so she brings up this question. And then in verse 21, we see Jesus' response. And his response is looking forward, right? He's looking forward. He's looking forward to, this Christian dispensation when God dwelleth not in temples made with hands, by that response that we see there. And in verse 22, Jesus responds to her concerns regarding, this form of worship, the location of worship. And, we see that, in his response, he's basically saying that, just because, the Samaritans were sincere and they, desired to begin like a new religious movement that kind of reflected their own culture, their own values, that isn't sufficient reasons to change what God has set in place, right? That's not enough to, change the will of God, right? God had manifested his will to the Jewish nation, and, his law could not be altered, right? It could not be altered. It can't be changed by the will of man. And we get that from that response that Jesus has to her. And in verse 23, Jesus points out there in verse 23, but the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. So Jesus pointed out that, to this woman, that the transition of worship, that it's going to happen soon, right? Right? It's almost ready to take place, right? It's, that the hour is coming and now is. So, he's letting her know that it's going to happen and it's going to take place and it's soon. It's going to happen soon. And before we go into the next section, I want to talk about that longer, but that's going to be for next class. Talking about the God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. But some things to think about in this conversation that Jesus has with this Samaritan woman. I want to think about the conversation he had with Nicodemus and see that that there's a little bit of contrast, right? There's a little bit of contrast because Nicodemus was a Jew, right? He was a Jew. She was a Samaritan, right? He was a man. She was a woman. He's a teacher of the law, right? Very educated. her, not so much. He was a respected religious leader, Nicodemus, and she was an adulteress. Right? And then Nicodemus recognized Jesus as a great teacher, and she didn't know who he was, right? Just a man out there by the well. So she didn't know who he was. And through both of these conversations, we see that Jesus was, wholeheartedly interested in both of them. In both of them. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. The, right, and that.
I'm just trying to, I'm trying to think of the teaching I had earlier, but I know we got two young Christians too, so in terms of understanding who the Samaritans were they culturally different? Were they, obviously they were looking for the Messiah as well, in Christ, but where do they, historically, where are they placed in relation to Jesus?
I'll try to summarize this as best I can, but Cody, Ron, James, you may be able to better explain this than I can. I think it's there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. But so that area of Jews, the Samaritans, they were intermarrying with the foreigners who had been brought into the land because of the Assyrian when they had overtaken them. Those foreigners were brought into that land, so they were intermarrying with those. The Jews there were intermarrying with those foreigners. And so they were taking on a lot of their customs and their pagan background, and then they started to get away from that and wanted to worship worship God as the law said, but they weren't doing it fully. And then so we had the Judean Jews, when they came back, they saw them as a mixed race, right? They saw them as a mixed race. And so that's where that animosity comes in, that prejudice comes in. They didn't see them as true Jewish, as truly Jewish. They saw them as like a hybrid. I don't know if I did that justice. That's
You're right. BC is when the Assyrian captivity comes in. So this is not a recent occurrence, right? The Samaritans, more than 750 years worth of history. Yes. So what the Assyrians did in captivity is they take away all the elite, the wealthy, the priesthood. They took all of that into captivity, but they did leave behind Jews that were the farmers and the keepers of the land, but they also transplanted people from other places. You're exactly right. They begin to intermarry. But the problems arise, they don't have a priesthood, they don't have a worship. And even the Old Testament shows where they're asking for priests to be sent back to teach them how to worship. Well, the Samaritans only adopted the first five books of law. So they, Proverbs, Psalms, all of that, they cut all of that out. They only worship, and the religion is centered around those first five books. And so then even 150 years into their, or 150 years back from this conversation, the Jewish high priest destroyed their temple on Mount Gerizim, and they were about to rebuild it. So you do have a lot of that going on. That is the beginning.
Thank you, brother. Yes, Ron. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of what you said. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Okay. Felix, you have your hand up?
Yeah.
13, is Jesus talking about being reborn with living water and the spirit of holiness?
Yeah, he's talking about salvation. I don't know if he's specifically referencing baptism here, but he's talking about salvation coming through him. James?
Somehow she had to conclude this is supposed to be the cross. She didn't get a whole Testament. He was even as far as saying, oh, he was the Bible. Samaritan was she was supposed to get a rules of things. She fought first.
Felix?
Okay, I'm talking about living water because people need water. But ordinarily, they don't drink from living water to be survived. So this living water you have to drink. Now, the spirit of holiness is a whole different mindset. We usually have a spirit that lives in lawfulness, it is about self. But if we transfer into a spirit that doesn't about self, then focus is on with maybe we'll get to where you were talking.
Thank you, Felix. We are out of time, and we'll pick up there next time, guys. Thank you. Thank you, sir.